What's up, college sports fans? I'm Stucky.
I'm Colin Wilson.
I'm Mike Calabrese.
I'm Maria Marino.
I'm Charlie DiSturco, and we're excited that the Big Bets on Campus brand is launching its very own YouTube channel.
You'll be able to find every episode of the BBOC podcast, live shows, and other college sports content on this new channel.
Not only will the channel be dedicated to betting on college sports, but you'll also be able to find exclusive interviews with former college athletes,
college football power rankings,
and updates on other topics like the brand new College Football 25 video game series and the ins and outs of the recruiting trail all the way down to the transfer portal.
Whether you're into college football,
college basketball,
college baseball, or any of the college sports,
we are the home for college sports, and BBOC is the channel for you.
Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any of the action. I'll see you there.
Welcome into the Action Network podcast presented by BetMGM. Brendan Glasheen in the host chair here with you for our 6th annual Experts Guide to Fantasy Football. We have 2 of Fantasy Pros' top 5 most accurate season-long rankers over the last couple of years, 3 counts as a few. Last 3 years, Chris Raybon, analyst at the Action Network, Sean Kerner, the director of predictive analytics at the Action Network. You can find their rankings all year long over at Fantasy Labs, fantasylabs.com. We have a lot to get to. We picked and chose, and we found the nuts and bolts from what you guys did last year, and we're getting set for the 2024 season just before the full week of preseason games with every team in action. No more of that Hall of Fame nonsense. So I will turn it over to both of you for most of this, and I'm really looking forward to this in terms of what I can learn, and I hope the audience can learn as well. So, Chris, I'll go to you first. From a big picture standpoint, we're going to use a lot of terminology throughout the course of this next hour or so. Terms, preparation, using the preseason, mock drafting, all of those kinds of things in this first segment. So take it away. Big picture approach. What's the first thing that comes to mind, Chris Raybon?
So I think the first thing you need to know is just your league rules, right? And this, for people that do this, it goes without saying, but know your starting lineup requirements. Know your draft timer. Know your site's average draft position, aka ADP. That's what we'll call it. Because these things are going to change whether you're drafting on, let's say, ESPN, Yahoo, NFL.com. So a guy who might be going a lot later on one site might be going earlier on another site in terms of their average draft position. And just the way you value players is going to change if you're, starting 2 wide receivers in a flex versus 3 wide receivers in a flex, things like that. So those are the most important things if you're just starting out in fantasy to know. Just know all of your league rules and league settings.
Sean, the rankings are near and dear to your heart. So how does that all factor into the big picture approach?
Yeah, so what Raybon said is correct. You have to know your league scoring settings. So I base my rankings based on those settings. And then you just want to have a general idea as how you approach a draft from different pick slots. And we'll get to that in a bit. I think that comes with practice, mock drafts. But also, when it comes to ADP, it gives you a rough idea where players are going to be drafted, but you have to know your league specifically. If you're in a home league, you're going to be playing with your buddies, your friends. You might know that you have 3 or 4 diehard Giants fans in your league. So if you like Malik Neighbors, you might have to take someone like that a bit earlier than ADP. So it's just understanding your league mates. It's a lot like playing poker. You have to read your league as well. So I use my rankings as a rough guideline, but also, I'm trying to anticipate where the rest of the league's going to go. So that's a big part of my strategy is knowing the actual league mates I'm drafting with.
I like how your example was the Giants, because it might be Malik Neighbors, and then it might just stop there. Right? Or, I don't know. You tell me. We'll use examples, I'm sure, throughout the course of the program. We'll mention the top of the draft boards, especially, no matter the format. So, Chris, I mentioned a second ago about mock drafting, because that's what a lot of people, as of today, as we sit here, are recording on August 5th, heading into week 2 of the preseason. Why does mock drafting matter so much, Chris?
It matters because, if you really care about a league and you're going to want to kind of go through it once and just get a sense of what value is available at each pick that you're up. So, you can kind of do it by just looking at ADP and going through it manually, but I think you get a better sense by mock drafting. And then one thing that I think is really cool that you could do if you don't want to straight up mock draft, is just kind of look at the board starting from the last round and then going backwards. Because what I like to do, for example, is say, okay, if there's 15 rounds in my draft, and I look at round 15 and say, okay, where's the value in round 15? And I might say, okay, there's a bunch of quarterbacks that I could still start here in round 15. So I can wait on quarterback until the end. I can be the last person to take a quarterback. Then I go to round 14 and I'd say, oh, there's actually a couple of wide receivers that I wouldn't mind, taking a flyer on as the last wide receiver on my bench. So, and you kind of go up, and it kind of shows you where the value is in your draft. And then you don't have to necessarily go through the hassle of mock drafting or anything like that. But you can also use our rankings and just, we have a tool where you can input your league settings and kind of get the rankings that would correspond to that. But I think mock drafting is important because, especially if you haven't drafted before, if you haven't drafted in this league, the specific league type on the site with the ADP for that specific year, it definitely, at least doing one, does give you I think a great sense of how the draft could go. And even something as simple as, getting used to the pick timer, if you're going to be drafting live, is something that I think mock drafting helps with. So those are the reasons why I think mock drafting are important, but you could also just do it in your head and kind of just go through it. But I think the important thing is to look at a draft, to look at ADP, to look at your roster requirements and go and look at each round where the value is positionally, because that's what's going to dictate your draft. You don't want to go and take, a quarterback and a tight end in the first two rounds when you feel like you could get, both of those positions at value in the double digit rounds, for example. So I think that's why mock drafting is very important.
An upside down approach that could throw a wrench into, I'm curious, Sean, if that throws a wrench into how you would absorb and process rankings, and that blends into positional scarcity in terms of trying to just maximize where you're drafting and what an ADP is, but also where you end up being and how the board looks.
Yeah, and I think that's something that you can kind of figure out when you're doing mock drafts. Like Raybon said, if you draft a quarterback and tight end early, maybe you do that in a mock draft, and you can kind of see that you screw yourself over because you end up taking a backup running back as your RB2. So I think those are the things that you can kind of iron out when you do those. But when it comes to position scarcity, every position's a bit different. Running backs, I guess you can say there's position scarcity there because a lot more teams use running back by committees now. So there's few and far between like true workhorse running backs these days. So, after the first 6 or 7 running backs are off the board, you start to have question marks about running backs. But that's not to say that you need to draft them early. The running back position itself is very fragile. They get injured a lot. So, while wide receiver is a little bit more stable, I would say that's a scarce position because that's a position that you can rarely find, a top 10, top 20 wide receiver on the waiver wire in season. So I actually consider the wide receiver position to be pretty scarce, which is why I like to attack it early in drafts. And then we could talk about, our approach a bit later on when it comes to the onesie positions like quarterback and tight end. But I just think these are the kinds of things that you figure out when you do enough drafts that, you can actually wait and still get some good running backs later or get a great quarterback later in the draft. So that's why I always like to practice, whether it's mock drafts or just doing actual best ball drafts, to kind of hone in on my actual approach.
And we're going to dig into the weeds on a lot of this later on, but just to use an example to play off Raybon, what he's talking about with scarcity of position. So, and I'm using a specific example, but when you say the stud wide receivers at the top, how much are you considering a guy that gets 7-8 targets a game? Who's his quarterback? Is it an offensive coach? I know those are all specific things and we'll get into that more and we'll dig out the weeds more later, but are those all, when you say scarcity, like when's the cutoff line when you get to a certain number of guys at receiver? And Sean, I think, did a good job of laying out the running back board after 7 or 8 guys. It gets not necessarily thin, but I like the word he used, fragile.
Yeah, so what I think Sean is alluding to here with the wide receivers is that in this day and age, when you're drafting in 2024, for example, I think the approach that's gonna work for most people is to draft wide receivers early and maybe a stud tight end and then running backs and then wait on quarterbacks. And the reason being when you ask like, okay, what's the cutoff? It depends on your league and how many wide receivers you're starting. Most leagues are going to be starting at least 2 wide receivers and then a flex. Some are 3 wide receivers, no flex. Some are 3 wide receivers and a flex or multiple flexes. But the point being, you're going to need 24 to 30. Your league is going to need 24 to 36 starting wide receivers, like in that league. And if you look around the NFL, there's, most teams, maybe like 2/3 of teams have like a bona fide, like top number 1 target that's going to get those 7-8 targets per game. I think the target volume is always going to be the most important thing, because even if you have like, to go back to like a Malik Neighbors, if he's getting, 7, 8, 9 targets, even on a bad team, that's going to be better than a guy getting, 4 to 5 targets on a really good team. Yeah. Almost all the time. There's going to be touchdown variance in that. But what Sean hit on that I think is really important is that these guys aren't going to be available on waivers, because it's not like running back where one guy goes down and a backup could come from, being a guy who's getting 1 or 2 carries, 1 or 2 snaps maybe, to a guy who's getting, 15, 20 touches in a game. Whereas with pass catchers, there's just kind of a pecking order. And so, you're not only not going to find these guys on the waiver wire, but it's even hard to find these guys in the late rounds. Like you might find a rookie gem or two, like a Puka Nacua, but, I'm sure Puka Nacua probably went undrafted in a bunch of leagues last year. So, those guys are just hard to find. Whereas because running backs aren't getting the high workloads that they used to, almost nobody is like, if you don't get that first draft slot and get a Christian McCaffrey, and there's a couple other guys, the Breece Halls and the Bijans, but if you don't get those guys, almost no one is really going to have those guys. In every league, you're going to start 2 running backs, maybe more if you're going to need one in the flex. But wide receiver these days, because of the pass happy nature of the NFL, wide receivers tend to be better flex options. Like if you're planning out your flex position, generally wide receiver at this point is better, because these running backs, there's just not enough of them getting these workhorse roles, and they're also getting injured more, which is something we also have to talk about. Like, there's if you have to start, there's a 17-week season, you have to start 2 running backs, and there's a bye week, and you have to project how many games these running backs are going to miss. You can kind of see how many running backs you need, how many wide receivers you're going to need. Everyone's going to kind of even out at running back, which is why it's not as scarce. Whereas if you don't get, those 25, 30 wide receivers that are you can rely on for those high target numbers, or like a stud tight ends, that's when it's not scarce anymore. There's a bunch of guys in that mid-tier, from like wide receiver 30 to 50 that are going to kind of even out over the course of the season. But those stud wide receivers, it's going to be really hard to replace those guys. So that's why they have turned into the most scarce position.
So as a listener and as a fan, I'm getting excited. And I think as a listener as well, not just hosting this, but as a listener, I can imagine listeners are already kind of picturing in their minds, or painting the picture of what depth charts look like and what kinds of teams you guys are talking about. Like you mapped it out. A good team might have a Malik Neighbors. I guess we'll just keep using the Giants as an example, because we did it. So what the hell? We'll keep doing it. But you map out some other teams. I'm just rattling them off the top of my head. CeeDee Lamb in Dallas, or Devontae Adams in Las Vegas. Just picking out those kinds of guys as the stud receivers. So that introduces the topic, Kerner, of streaming, and why there's an importance of streaming. And it's not just streaming, but how to stream. Let's dive into that.
And what is it too?
Yeah.
That's
a good call, Raybon.
Yeah, so streaming is a concept of you're treating that roster slot as just a week-to-week decision, where you could be just taking the best player available on the waiver wire any given week. So the best example of that, I think, would be the quarterback position in leagues where you only draft one quarterback. You're often going to have 15 or more starting quarterbacks that week available on the waiver wire. And oftentimes, one of those quarterbacks I might have ranked inside my top 10, my top 15, just based on the matchup or how, that quarterback's playing. So if let's say I skip out on drafting a top 10 quarterback and I just take a late round quarterback, any given week, there might be a quarterback available on the waiver wire that I should be starting. And I have done articles in the past where I do this throughout the season, and I was actually able to stream a top 10, sometimes like a top 8 quarterback just by doing this, by taking the best available quarterback on the waiver wire every week. So I think it's a very underappreciated strategy in the draft, just knowing that you have that as a safety net if you don't take a quarterback early. And oftentimes, by implementing this strategy, I've actually ended up with like a top 5 quarterback for the rest of the season. I did that with, Justin Herbert his rookie season, CJ Stroud last year. I know some people picked him up. So this is a very viable strategy where the worst case scenario, you can just be taking a top 10, top 15 quarterback every week. And the best case scenario is you actually end up keeping one of them as a top 5 quarterback. So that's kind of what we say when you don't really have to take a quarterback early. You have this option later in the draft to maybe get a sneaky upside flyer like a Jane Daniels, or just by streaming, you can end up with a top 5 quarterback or top 10 quarterback. And another thing to just point out real quick is kicker and defense. I consider those 2 slots to be streaming only. I never draft one of those positions unless the league rules make you draft one. Right. So what I do is typically, instead of drafting a kicker defense at the end of the draft, I just draft 2 more backup running backs. Just in the event their starting running back gets injured or benched, whatever, anything can happen the weeks heading up to week 1. I've done this before and ended up with, like, James Conner was an example. I picked him up instead of drafting a kicker defense, and Le'Veon Bell was suspended a handful of games and ended up missing most of the season. And James Conner was a league-winning pick. So I think instead of drafting a kicker or defense, I always say to draft 2 flyer running backs. Anything can happen. And if it doesn't pan out by week 1, you could drop them.
Right,
you're
holding on. Defense. You're holding on before you have to let them go to the market.
It's a lottery ticket. Yeah. And then obviously the week of, you're going to need to pick up a kicker or defense. At that point, you can release these guys or whoever you want. Yeah, but at that point, every week you can stream a kicker defense. There's going to be a top 10 one available. So I in typical leagues where you don't have to draft a kicker defense, I advise not doing it.
And so just to put a bow on that, when you think about positional scarcity, if people want takeaways, there's 32 teams in the league. Every team's going to start a kicker. Every team's going to start a defense. Every team's going to start a quarterback. There's enough of those guys to go around that you can stream them, that you don't have to draft them. So the real thing is, don't be afraid to draft your 4th wide receiver before your starting quarterback. Don't be afraid to draft your 3rd or 4th running back before you draft your quarterback. Those are the guys where with wide receiver, you want quality. Those guys are scarce. There's only going to be so many guys getting those, 7, 8, 9 targets. And the same even goes for tight end. Like tight end, if you can get a stud, it's a lot better because streaming a tight end is a lot harder because even though there's 32 teams, tight ends aren't always very involved in their teams' offenses outside of the stud. So with wide receivers, you want quality, which you want in those studs, which is why you draft them early. And then middle rounds, you want to kind of load up. And mid to late rounds, you want to be loading up on quantity at running back because running backs miss about twice as many games as other positions. And most of those guys are going to get drafted. Like, about in a 12-team league, people are probably like 50 to 60 at least. Running backs are going to get drafted. So most teams starter and backup is going to get drafted. So even if you project a running back to start the season as, the clear backup, because running backs are so injury prone, you're still getting a high upside guy, even if you're taking like, the RB 50 in the, 9th or 10th round before you have a quarterback, so that's really the important thing to keep in mind. You don't have to draft your starting lineup first. And try to fill your quarterback spot. And, even for some really, it's, people that are new to drafting, sometimes I even see them, draft their kicker and defense before they start drafting their bench, which is also a big mistake, as Sean said. You don't even need to draft those guys, period, unless they make you. And you just have to make sure to pick some up before lock, in week 1 and keep streaming. But yeah, don't be afraid to just load up on wide receivers, running backs, and, a stud tight end. And even your bench for the wide receivers and running backs before you draft quarterback.
Just as fans of the sport, it is fascinating. You've got your Fantasy Pros ADP rankings up for quarterback, and I'm glad Kerner brought up the rookie class because Caleb Williams and Jaden Daniels are inside the top 15. And 2 rookies last year, Stroud and Richardson, are in the top 6. And maybe those guys at some point last year were already top 12. And I'm using 12 just because if it's a 12-team league, right?
Mm-hmm.
And your cutoff point after, so say 16. I think most leagues would go up to 16. Most 8, 10, 12, 16. Maybe some 14s. But, Justin Herbert's your cutoff line. And then to Kerner's point, you got guys like Lawrence, Cousins, Rodgers, Stafford, all available to you after 16 guys. But I'm glad you brought up the rookie class, because I think that's just a reflection of where the league is too, where the league's going as a pass-happy league. And if you can get it done on the ground, as we saw from Richardson, Kyler Murray, those guys being at the top. So great stuff on streaming. There's your lesson on streaming, what it means, what the term means, and then how to actually do it. Let's go to draft slot. Let's go into draft slot. I'll let you take this one first, Raybon, as far as ways in which draft slot can matter or not matter. And you kind of hit on this a second ago. When you're building your team, don't be tempted to go to a quarterback, or if you missed out on the stud tight ends, kicker, defense, why it's okay to go to a 4th receiver or your 3rd or 4th running back. That I kind of blends to the next topic, which is draft position, draft slot.
Yeah, so draft slot, when we're referring to draft slot, that's where you're picking. And I think some people overthink this. Remember, average draft position is average. So, a lot of times people want to kind of plan out their draft and think they know who's going to be there when. You can do that like if you're a number 1 pick, you should be drafting Christian McCaffrey. And you could kind of plan your draft. Okay, I'm going to draft Christian McCaffrey first. But, after those first few picks, what really data-wise statistically shows the earlier you pick tends to be better. So you have a little bit of advantage. The later you pick, I think the advantage is then you get to kind of double up on round 1 caliber talent, at the end of round 1 and the start of round 2. But I think when it comes to draft slot, just the thing to keep in mind is if you're able to know, because some leagues you don't even know your draft slot till right before, then you kind of have to prepare for different scenarios. But if you do know your draft slot, the thing, if you're near the front or the back of the draft, you can kind of, there's going to be only either you're going to be at the turn, or if you're 1 or 12 or, the first or last person in the round, or you're going to be close to the edge, you can kind of use that to your advantage because you could see who other people are picking and kind of predict the next few players that might go off the board. Like if you're up and you need a quarterback, but the 2 people picking after you already have quarterbacks, then you don't have to pick a quarterback until it comes back around to you and things like that. When you're in the middle of a draft, that's when you're just kind of you're really looking to let value fall to you, and that's when you have to really be prepared for a really diverse range of outcomes with each. With each pick, you just kind of be ready to kind of go best player available, best value available. Obviously you can use our rankings and our tool to kind of figure that out, but that's kind of the difference between, the draft slot. But I think that the thing is just remember that you don't want to have a super rigid approach and think that exactly what's going to happen just because you're picking at a certain slot. Like beyond, the first few picks of the first round, it could go in a lot of different ways. So you just want to kind of understand the value pockets positionally. Like, okay, if you're at the end of the round 1, for example, that the top 3 running backs are going to be gone, and it's probably more of you could probably double up on receiver, and you might be better off getting some running backs in the middle rounds. And there's only a few stud tight ends. Most of those guys go in the first 5 rounds, and so depending on their ADPs, you can kind of get a sense of which one or will be available and things like that. So that's how draft slot comes into play for me.
So at the top of the show, we have 2 of the Fantasy Pros top 5 most accurate rankers, right? So I know you guys are very highly sought out people, but what I'm gathering from Raybon is this is where the human element of pressure and overthinking kicks in for people. So Kerner, I bring that up because consider the listener, consider the audience when they're like, holy crap, what do I do? I need this, but this is coming off the board, or I had the number 1 pick, I drafted McCaffrey, but I'm not drafting again for another number of picks, whatever the number is, in a 12-team, 10-team league. People are freaking out, man. Like, people are freaking out. They want to make sure they capitalize on the pick. So when you put out your rankings over on Fantasy Pros, like how do you avoid making mistakes and try not to overthink too much and stay composed?
Well, first of all, take a deep breath, relax. You're supposed to be having fun. It is fantasy football.
Yeah,
after
people want to
all.
win,
But,
Kerner. People want to win.
oh, I want to. I agree
I know
with
you
them.
want to win, but like you're good. You're really good. That's why I mentioned the top five, the two of the top five thing again. It's worth repeating.
This is where mock drafts and practicing and preparing can alleviate the stress. So when it comes to draft slots, if you have picks 1 through 4, you should have a general idea of what you're going to do, which players are going to be available in the first few rounds, and you can figure that out by doing some mock drafts. Plus, if you're in a league where you're doing it online or something and there's like a timer, it's very, very important to start planning. I would say 8 picks out, you should have a queue set up already of players that you want to draft. And don't be surprised if everybody in your league snipes all those players. I would say a lot of the mistakes happen with what you just laid out. When you're freaking out, your queue's gone, you don't know what to do, and you have 1 minute left on the clock.
Yep.
Try to avoid that. Try to over prepare. If there's 8 picks before you, try to have 9 players in the queue. Be over prepared and just, understand that, everybody's going to be drafting from the same list. They might be gone, and just kind of plan ahead. Don't let it sneak up on you, because that's when mistakes happen. Sorry, Raybon, what was that?
Oh, no, I was going to add to what you were saying. One of the ways you can do that too is most sites let you upload pre-draft rankings too. So you can just grab our rankings off Fantasy Labs and like update and upload that. So then even if you do timeout or you do freak out, at least you're going to have like you're not just drafting based on the site ADP, which is usually not, it's never as sharp as, it's going to be as sharp as some rankings that, you actually trust. And then another thing, Sean, and you and I always talk about this, is when you're in the first few rounds, you can't win your draft in the first few rounds. You cannot win your draft in the first few rounds. Get it through your head over and over again. You cannot win your draft in the first few rounds, but you can definitely lose it. So don't obsess over the first 4 or 5 rounds of the draft, because that's when there's going to be very a lower range of outcomes for each player. They're all going to be pretty good players. They're all going to be studs. So the only thing you really want to avoid in those first 4 or 5 rounds is taking guys that are very high risks, because everyone's going to have a high ceiling, but some guys will have a lower floor than others. Like for example, you have guys like maybe a Derrick Henry who's great, but he's 30 years old now. That's for a running back, that's pretty old. That's a little lower floor. So when I'm up and I'm choosing between Henry and a receiver, I'm going to go receiver more often than not, just because the floor is gonna, I could lose my draft that way. And Henry might not even be the best example, because I think he'll be okay in Baltimore, or I think he'll be fine. But there are guys every year who kind of stick out like a sore thumb. And those are the guys, like if you feel uncertainty about them, just avoid them, because you just want to take high floor guys in the first few rounds. But just there's only so many ways that those first few rounds are going to go, and you're going to get 4 to 5 really good players either way. So when you're preparing for your draft, and what you really need to focus on and kind of analyze, and if you're going to put any time into it, is the middle to late rounds. That's where drafts are won. There's only going to be so many ways there's only so many stud tight ends in the first 5 rounds. There's only a couple of quarterbacks, and even this year, there's not even that many. There's only like 12 to 13 running backs going in the first 5 rounds in a lot of drafts these days. So you kind of know what you're going to be dealing with. And it's those middle rounds where you're gonna make your hay, and those late rounds where if you could pick up a diamond in the rough or two, that's where you want to take your risks. And the later you get in the draft, the more risk you want to take.
We're building a glossary during this podcast, so we'll dive into, Raybon teased the word floor, so we'll dive into ceiling, floor, and volatility in a minute in terms of what those words mean and why they are important to know. You will be quizzed after the show. But let's wrap on this section of draft position, or draft slot, I should say, Raybon, and why tiering is important. When you dive into tiering, and then the specific tier that you wanted to touch on, the frozen pond tier.
Tiers are my thing. So just in general, when it comes to tiers, there's clusters at each position where, for example, this year I have wide receiver 17 to wide receiver 27. I have them separated by just a few points. So I consider them all very close in terms of value. So the ideas of drafting from tiers is, why draft someone from the top of that cluster of 11 receivers when you could get a guy 1 to maybe 3 rounds later that I only have a couple points off. So that's kind of how I view tiers. Typically, I don't want to be drafting a guy at a top of a tier knowing I can get a guy with similar value a few rounds later. Whereas if there's just one player left from that tier, in theory, there's going to be a pretty big drop off from him to the next receiver or next handful of receivers. So I'm usually looking at every position, seeing how many players are left in a given tier, and kind of use that as a rough guide to who I'm drafting. But when it comes to the frozen pond tier, that's the tier I talk about in running backs, where their rank might match up my projections. But when it comes to running backs in general, I mentioned this earlier in the pod, they're the most fragile position.
Yep.
They're usually the smaller player in the field taking the most hits. So unfortunately, they're the most injured player. And, Raybon mentioned it earlier, usually there's one running back that's the starter taking the most, touches in a backfield, but that could flip. You could have a guy lose his job, things like that. So it's very volatile. So usually every year it changes every year, but running backs 10 through 30 is where you're going to have some running backs where they're ranked appropriately. That's where I have them ranked going into the season. But there's some red flags where their floor is, a lot lower than you'd want based on, their injury history. Maybe they ended the last season really good. So we're kind of overhyping them, but then they regress the next year, or they have, touchdown regression, or they have a very good backup and they could lose their job. And I guess an example would be Cam Akers last year was the RB22. And he had finished the season before. He was like the number 2 running back over the last 6 games.
He had a good postseason.
He had a good postseason. So it's he's the Rams starting back heading into this year. So my projections lined up with the running back 22. But just given, how Sean McVay can be fickle with his running backs year to year, Kyron Williams, sure enough, ended up being, the starting running back, the workhorse back. So Cam Akers ended up being a bust. But he's an example of a type of back.
And Sean McVay drafted Blake Corum. We had.
That's so Kyron Williams. Kyron Williams might actually fit the bill being a frozen pond type of running back just based on Sean McVay's history, based on Blake Corum being drafted and he's his backup. So that's just an example of when it comes to running back specifically. In that range, I'm always very careful, and I have to ask myself, do they have enough red flags where it's worth waiting and drafting a running back later? So each position, I think every tier represents something else based on, upside, their floor. So when I write my tiers articles, I'm going through very thoroughly how I'm kind of thinking about each tier at each position.
When Raybon, that speaks to your point why you don't win a draft after your first 3 picks, right? Because then it just, if you try to lock in a rigid early round strategy, then you're toast.
Yeah, that's something I think these days, we hear a lot, 0 running back. Really, it's the running back strategies because those kind of define, what you're going to do at other positions. So, there's 0 running back, which is you're going to wait and not draft running backs until, maybe the 6th round or so. There's hero running back where you draft 1 running back early and then kind of do a 0 running back strategy for all your other running backs. And then there's, robust running back or whatever you want to call it, where you kind of go running back heavy. That was the old school, draft 2 running backs with your first 2 picks. I think, you have to, you can use your draft slot to kind of say, okay, I'm early in the draft, so this is where the value is based on tiers. But to Sean's point about tiers, the other thing with tiers is it kind of helps with your overall ranks, because that's a lot of times where I think people trip up is should I draft a running back or wide receiver here? Should I go for the stud tight end? And so a lot of times it's okay, for example, this year, I think, it's McCaffrey's in a tier of his own. Then you have, the top tier of wide receivers. Then you have that second tier of running backs with, Breece Hall and Bijan Robinson. And then you have another tier of wide receivers. And, to Sean's point with the frozen pond tier, maybe your tier of, wide receivers from 17 to 27, you're still valuing that tier ahead of the frozen pond tier with running back 10 to 30, and all of those tiers in between, the sub tiers of that. So that's where it's really important. And generally, and then you have, a couple of stud tight ends in their tier. And, I would kind of put those guys, somewhere in the second to third round. And if those guys are gone, okay, you're going to keep hitting receiver. But the thing is, you don't want to get caught up in these rigid strategies as much as just knowing how to use each of them, because there's going to be times when your draft starts and everyone wants wide receivers. And so you might get, maybe Breece Hall and Bijan Robinson fall to, pick like 11 and 12 or something like that. And then, you should be attacking those guys because you're getting value there. But, if people are going more traditional, a lot of running backs early, you should probably be hammering wide receiver. You should probably be trying to get that stud tight end. So, our rankings it will kind of be, for this individual year, it will give you more direction as to what to do exactly. But that's something you just got to kind of think about. If you're just going into the draft with a rigid strategy, that's where you're going to run into trouble. You should just know how to use each strategy and say, okay, if I start wide receiver heavy, these are the running backs I like in the middle rounds. If I start running back heavy, these are the wide receivers I like in the middle rounds. Maybe this is a guy who is kind of on that cusp of like, has wide receiver one upside that I'm going to target, guys like a Jackson Smith and a Jigba. Maybe you think he's going to break out in year two. A Deontay Johnson. Maybe you think he's going to, turn into that number one option for Bryce Young. Guys like that, if you're drafting running backs early, you have to be aware of that. So you have to kind of just be aware of how to use each strategy. And you could kind of go into the draft saying, okay, based on my draft slot, this might be the strategy that works best, but be prepared to use any of those strategies. They all can work. It still comes down to, drafting the right players and constructing your team right, in the middle rounds based on how you started.
Falling under the umbrella, and again, you can find Sean and Chris's rankings over at fantasylabs.com. So falling under the umbrella of rankings are some terms that we want to discuss at length. And what these terms mean, and then knowing what they mean, how to apply them. So the four terms that we're going to discuss here are ceiling, floor, volatility, and then the range of outcomes. So I'll let you each take two. Chris, which one do you want to pick first?
I'll go. Ceiling and floor are easy. So
they're all
okay.
They're kind of all the same.
Yeah. So I mean, Sean, you can actually go ahead with this. I feel like I was talking a long time in the last segment.
Yeah. So these kind of mean the same thing. Volatility and range of outcomes is just what we're expecting from the player. Like when Chris and I make projections for, say, like Cooper Kupp for 1,200 yards, it doesn't mean that we expect them to get exactly 1,200 yards. There's a range of outcomes. So we're thinking every player has their own unique range of outcomes. And when it comes to floor and ceiling, I would say ceiling would be their, best case scenario range of outcomes, whereas the floor is going to be the worst case scenario of the range of outcomes. And, oftentimes this just has to do with, what we know about the player. Someone like Keenan Allen that's played, 8 straight seasons getting, the same stat line. We kind of know who he is at this point. So he has a narrower range of outcomes. Whereas, Marvin Harrison Jr., we haven't seen him play yet. We know he's going to be great, but he has, wider range of outcomes than somebody that we've, seen for years in the league. But also when it comes to their floor and ceiling, sometimes, when it comes to their floor, I would say every player's floor is them getting injured and missing a ton of time or the entire season. But it's also, I think there's a complex range of outcomes when it comes to their own teammates' health. So an example would be Garrett Wilson last year was expected to be a top 10 wide receiver with Aaron Rodgers, but Aaron Rodgers got hurt on the first drive of the game, and Garrett Wilson ended up being the wide receiver 31. So you could say he finished closer to his floor, but that wasn't necessarily his fault. That was his quarterback play. So that's why you see him back up to being in the top 10 wide receivers. So I think it's understanding also based on previous games, where does that fall in the range of outcomes and things like that. Yeah. And on the other side, when it comes to like running backs, I talk about this in my running back upside chart. I think of every running back in terms of their ceiling based on, their talent level, obviously. And if they're able to command more touches or be more efficient than we expected heading in the season. But it's also if their teammate, the starting running back, were to get injured. So someone like we mentioned,
Zamir White last 4 games,
exactly,
last season, right?
And that is more predictive than I think people give credit for. So going into the season, Blake Corum, we mentioned him earlier. He's the rookie running back for the Rams.
Yep.
He's likely going to back up Kyren Williams heading into the season. We know that. But if Kyren Williams suffers a season-ending injury in, say, week 1, Corum would likely take over as the starting running back, put up top 10 numbers. So I consider that part of his ceiling. And knowing that in the later rounds, I kind of map out which running backs have the highest ceiling based on the opportunity. If the starting running back were to miss time. So that's part of their ceiling projection for me is just their teammates' health as well. So that's why with each player, each position, there's different range of outcomes that we talk about. It's really hard to convey in our just median projections in our rankings. So that's why when we talk about floor ceiling, we're really talking about these extra cases for each player and how their range of outcomes could be different compared to other players in their position. And that's sometimes why we would draft them or not draft them ahead of other players.
And to add on to that, there's also an element in when you talk about floor and ceiling of just the type of player they are. So, for example, running backs that play all 3 downs have higher floors than running backs like that might come off the field on 3rd down, and seed some passing down.
Or red zone, right? Goal line stuff.
Right. Yeah. These days, it's more guys that come like, for example, and not to pick on Derrick Henry, but even though they, he's gonna getting a ton of carries for Baltimore, he might be off the field on passing downs, hurry up situations, and in 3rd downs, even guys like a guy like Justice Hill probably plays a significant amount of snaps. So that's something to think about.
Not to mention his quarterback is also very capable of doing it himself.
Exactly.
So and then every quarterback is like that. I realize that.
Right. And so
have that in Tennessee, right? He didn't have Lamar Jackson in Tennessee. Very different circumstances.
Exactly. And so you think about that with a guy like James Cook and Josh Allen, even a guy like Saquon Barkley with Jalen Hurts. But and then there's also for wide receivers, there's the type of targets you're getting. So think of a guy like Gabriel Davis, who he gets a lot of high leverage fantasy targets, deep targets, red zone targets. But when you're in a redraft league where you have to set your lineup each week, so not a best ball league, that might not be ideal because you don't know which weeks he's going to go off. Those kind of targets are volatile. So, and especially because most leagues are at least half point PPR, if not full point, the guys that get a lot of targets and get, short to intermediate is really kind of the ideal kind of targets. Those are the guys that are going to tend to be the most, have the higher floors for wide receivers than guys who are going to run a lot of low percentage routes deeper down the field. Those guys are going to have high ceilings, but, floor, and you're not going to always be able to predict them. So, and in redraft, a lot of times, when you're setting that starting lineup, you're going to want floor. So that's why early in the draft, you definitely don't want guys with low floor. But as the season progresses, as the draft progresses, you can start targeting guys with the high ceilings because you're not going to really find any more high floor guys. So that's why, for example, targeting rookie wide receivers that not even just the type of targets they're getting, but also their path. Sean talked about it with running back, their path to a starting role. With wide receivers, it's their path to being a number 1 target. So a guy like, let's say Troy Franklin in Denver, rookie wide receiver, played with Bo Nix. But Cortland Sutton's probably on the lower end of, number 1 wide receivers, and it's kind of wide open behind him. So you'd say, okay, Franklin has a outside shot at being a number 1 or at least a number 2. Same thing with a guy like Keon Coleman in Buffalo. He's battling Khalil Shakir, Curtis Samuel, and Mac Hollins. At wide receiver, he could be their number 1 wide receiver. You could, and to give examples of when this has worked, think of, a few years ago, Terry McLaurin, when he was coming into the league, and, Washington, I think, had other, like, they had Kelvin Harmon and some other guys, like ahead of him. And it was like, no, it ended up being
Samuel
Terry,
Who was
Marquise Brown. Yeah. Marquise Brown with the Ravens. There's AJ Brown even with Tennessee that rookie year. There's always going to be those kind of guys that because the wide receiver or the pass catching corps is weaker, they're going to have these shots. And I think that those guys late in the draft are better than a guy like Tyler Boyd, for example, who might, his median projection might be a few more targets as that, locked in slot receiver in Tennessee. But he's, even if DeAndre Hopkins misses more time and like Calvin Ridley, he's still Calvin Ridley's there. DeAndre Hopkins is not going to miss the whole season, probably. Traylon Burks is a talented guy who could challenge Boyd. Yeah. So that's how you also have to think about ceiling and floor. And that's why you want to target you in the first few rounds. That's why it's all about floor, because everyone has a high ceiling. As the draft progresses, almost everyone has a low floor. That's when you target these high ceiling guys.
Good stuff. That's really interesting, and it dives into a whole bunch of different factions. That's really good stuff. Do you want to spend a second on best ball versus season long? Because I know we had that in our notes as well to dive into those strategies, Sean.
Yeah, I think that's an important topic, and it kind of does stem from our floor ceiling discussion.
Yep.
So let's start off with season long leagues. In season long leagues, it's typically a head-to-head league where every week you're playing one other team. You only need to score more points than one other team. So in general, you're going to want higher floor guys. I mean, you still want to shoot for guys with upside and a high ceiling, but in season-long formats, floor is more valuable because, again, you only need to beat one team a week. So if you're finishing in the top 50th percentile in points that week, you're more likely to win your matchup. So that's the format where I tend to go safer, shoot for floor. But when it comes to best ball, it's all about upside and ceiling. So you're going to be a little bit more aggressive and go for guys with more upside, higher ceiling. Maybe they're more boom bust every week. And the theory is you're essentially playing the rest of your league. So you need a really big score to actually take down the league. And that's why you want to implement other aggressive strategies like stacking. So taking a quarterback with a couple pass catchers or a few pass catchers from that offense, because they're very correlated. So if, a quarterback has a really good season, it's very likely the other pass catchers exceeded expectations as well. So that's another way how you're just kind of elevating your team ceiling as a whole and more likely to take down, all other 11 teammates in your league. So that's kind of how I think about it is, season long head-to-head formats, you want a higher floor, whereas best ball, you're shooting for a higher ceiling when it comes to your team's construction.
And to add to that, I think a good way to think about it, or a good way to contrast the strategies, is in a season-long league where you want your high floor. If you draft a running back, especially your RB1, your top running back, you may want to draft his backup later in the draft, especially if he's cheap. If he's not, if he doesn't take like another premium mid-round pick. And to get his handcuffs, so that if that running, like if you draft a Kyron Williams, maybe you want to draft a Blake Corum, and kind of cover your bases. But in best ball, you never want to draft two running backs on the same team, because you want that top ceiling outcome for Kyron Williams, which means he holds that job all year. He does the same thing he did last year. He plays even more games than he did last year, and Corum is a non-factor. That's how you want to kind of think about it. In redraft, regular season long, you're handcuffing, or you're at least thinking about it. Whereas in best ball, that's completely off the table, because you want every one of your guys to have that, highest ceiling outcome available to you. So, taking two guys on the same team, you're just cannibalizing your upside. Two running backs on the same team, that is.
Let's talk about avoiding bus, because that annoys people. It frustrates people. And typically, I think you'd find out once the season starts. Maybe it takes a little bit longer than others. You guys can tell me when we discuss this about what actually defines a bust. But for the purposes of this podcast, it's the expert's guide to fantasy football and draft. We're talking about drafting. How did Raybon avoiding busts? What are some keys to that?
So each position is going to kind of have its differences. So the first thing is a bust to me is a player you draft in the premium rounds, like in the first 5 rounds, that, doesn't even either finishes as a low end starter or not even startable. And then, going from there, anyone you draft as a starter that's not startable, I think would be considered a bust. So a couple of things you could do to avoid those guys. I already mentioned, just looking for guys with high floors and some of the things you can avoid, but at running back, I did a piece where I looked at running backs that changed teams in the offseason. Those guys tend to underperform ADP a lot more than guys who stayed on the same team. Older running backs, older players, period, at any position, but especially running back, anyone after 27 is when they peak. Wide receivers, anyone, after their, 31, 32, you start to see a steeper decline. Tight end, same thing. Maybe a little older for tight end, but age is something you always want to look for. For running backs and offensive line, teams that just bad quarterback play, which you mentioned, Glash, for pass catchers, and just generally anything that's new, it makes it harder to project. So even a guy like, we talked about Keenan Allen and how.
Hold on. Never mind. Go ahead. Well, when you say new, I thought you were going to go to rookies, but that's like Keenan Allen being in Chicago now with the new.
No, yeah, rookies are different. So rookies generally are going later. So it's they're usually more like they're not going to bust as much just because they're not going as high. But even a guy like a Keenan Allen, yes, he's been ultra consistent, but he's got a new quarterback who's a rookie, by the way, and he's on a team with two other receivers that are probably the most talented receivers he's played with, no disrespect to Mike Williams. So even a guy like him, there's a little bit of bust potential that there wasn't in these last, in the other 8 years or whatever of his career. But I'd say the big things are running backs on new teams, older running backs, running backs with teams with bad offensive lines or just teams that are expected to not score a lot of points, and then pass catchers with bad quarterbacks, or if you're especially because usually for a number one receiver, those studs, they're locked in. But when you start getting into those wide receivers outside that top 30 or so, a lot of times those are going to be the second wide receiver on a team, and it's like a guy like a Tyler Lockett, he could get overtaken by a guy like Jackson Smith-Njigba this year. Right. So looking at the threats and of the unknown. So mentioned guys like Terry McLaurin and AJ Brown a few years ago. Whoever the guys were in front of them, I'm sure somebody on those teams were drafted as their team's expected number one receiver. But if you have guys who are under them, rookies with the unknown who could just come in and outplay them. Elijah Moore comes to mind a couple years ago when they just drafted Garrett Wilson. Elijah Moore, everyone, was so excited for him to draft him because he had a really good end to the season before. But Garrett Wilson just kind of blew him out of the water, and Moore also, didn't play well. But, if you kind of looked and said, wow, this team spent a high draft pick on a wide receiver, maybe this guy's not as safe. And also Zach Wilson was his quarterback, I think, at the time. So, looking at things like that are some of the ways you can avoid bust. And track record too. If a guy only had one season of production, especially if it was kind of out of the blue and it wasn't his first season, you always want to kind of make sure that that's repeatable and the circumstances and the environment is the same or similar before you invest a high pick. If it's late, then you're not worried about bust because then you're just going for upside.
Yeah, and Sean, I think this is something that you factor in quite a bit when you do your preseason NFL betting, which is we're in the season, 'tis the season of that. Paying attention to coaching decisions too, like press conferences during the week if a guy's in the dog. I mean, that speaks for all of this that we're talking about, but maybe with busts too, like if you find out if a guy's in the doghouse, if it's a contract dispute or something along those lines too. But anything to add, Sean, on busts before we move on?
No, I agree. I just think for me, just in general, I consider busts are players that they're likely their ADP is closer to where I think their ceiling is, like their best case outcome would be. So that's in general. Raybon hit the nail on the head, position by position. But for me, if their ADP is closer to where I consider their ceiling, I consider them a potential bust. But again, I'm guilty of it every year. I'm going to draft some bust on my team. It's unavoidable, really, right. To get a perfect draft. But I think that Raybon laid out some really good points on the general things that might lead to a bust. But again, this goes back to where I was thinking I consider every player on a range of outcomes. And if their ADP is closer to their ceiling, that's sort of a red flag for me when it comes to busts.
Oh, one more thing that we didn't mention that's important. Guys that are injured heading into the year, that's a red flag. If they're just struggling with nagging injuries in the preseason, maybe they even might miss week 1 or 2. If
So,
they're
DeAndre Hopkins, TJ Hawkinson, those are some big
guys like that.
positions. Yep.
So what ends up happening with a lot of those guys is people, drafters tend to overvalue those guys, specifically the guys that we already know they're probably going to miss games to start the year. They tend to be drafted too high. I remember, Jamison Williams was a guy like that. It could be a suspension even, but people generally just don't rate those players correctly because it comes down to now you have to project the exact amount of games and reconcile that with the who else is on the team and what they're going to do. So it's a tough projection. And so I noticed that average draft position tends to overrate, the market tends to overrate those kind of players. But just anyone that's kind of struggling, especially if they're not a stud and the teams are drawing up plays for them. Like if it's a team's like number 2 wide receiver, like to go back to like Seattle, if like Tyler Lockett is injured, banged up all preseason coming into the year, I would worry about him a lot more than if he was completely healthy, because DK Metcalf's still going to be that number 1 guy there. Guys like that, once you get to those middle round guys, a lot of times, if they're struggling with injuries, it can be a big red flag, but especially the guys who are going to miss games. They're going to start the year on the pup. They're going to whatever the case might be. Those guys tend to always be overdrafted because people are like, oh, I'll just stash them or whatever. Not, but why not just look for a guy who can get you 17 weeks of upside instead of trying to stash a guy? Because a lot of times when you're already injured heading into the year or you're going to miss time, you're at a higher risk of re-injury and you might not be 100% when you come back. So every once in a while you'll hit on those, but if you're a good enough drafter, and if you're following us and checking out our rankings, you should be, you're going to be able to just find alternatives to those guys. So that's another thing that I think is important to keep in mind.
Good call out. Yeah. Cause I know we talked about, it's one thing when an injury pops up out of nowhere and we talked about streaming, but having a known injury going into a season, that is something we didn't spend a lot of time on. So that's a good call out by Raybon.
Before we go on, one thing we do want to touch on with drafting is, and Sean can speak to this, is how to use our rankings or anybody's rankings, how to use them in a draft. Because, and Sean can elaborate on this, but basically just because we have a guy ranked RB10 doesn't mean you should take him as the 10th running back off the board if his average draft position is, let's say, RB20. So, Sean, you could speak more to that.
So like when you're using our rankings, like Raybon said, if we have a guy ranked RB10, let's say, and he's typically being drafted, say, RB20, we're that far off from consensus, you don't really want to take him RB10. You want to take him closer to ADP because that's how you get the value. You're getting a running back much later on that we're ranking higher. Again, ADP you can't take, literally, but it just gives you an idea that you might be able to get this running back a round or two later and take somebody that is obviously going to be drafted before that running back is off the board. So that's great advice. When you use our rankings, you always have to factor in, like, when can I actually get this player? And if it's a round or two later, you don't want to take them because you're kind of killing the value that way. It's obviously a player that we're, higher end than the market, but the best way to like maximize the value in your draft is you take these players closer to their ADP. And that's how you can really build, a championship type lineup.
Yeah. So if we have guys, let's say if we have a guy ranked 2 rounds higher than ADP, you can even split the difference and you could still, hey, I want to be safe and get this value. Yeah. Take him 1 round higher and you're still getting value and you're not risking him being off the board either. So it's kind of a give or take. So because now you have value to play with. So that's one thing I just wanted to clarify, because a lot of times people will just draft straight off rankings. But if a lot of times, especially with us, because we're, to get to, being top 5 in accuracy, a lot of times you're going to deviate from the consensus, right? So when you're looking at, like, let's say our rankings, you're going to see guys that are different from the consensus. That doesn't mean you want to take them in the exact order we have them ranked. If their ADPs are going to be a lot later, you want to, that goes back to position scarcity. So maybe with that running back, if you're getting the 10th running back, at RB20, that gives you the opportunity to then, save that pick that you would have taken him 10th and draft a stud tight end or something like that. So that's how you really can kind of use those rankings to and use those rankings versus ADP to increase the potential for your team.
Okay, very good. We'll wrap with how to go about midseason strategy, because that will come up for people. So that could waivers, how and when to trade. I'll let each of you weigh in, and then we can wrap this sucker up. So I'll let Sean take the lead on this as far as because I know, Sean, during the season you'll put out an article over on the Action app, actionnetwork.com, top waiver wire dudes that are available. And I mean, trading, that's kind of a case by case basis. But why don't you speak to the waiver wire and how that should all factor into people's strategies when the season begins?
Yeah, so waivers. Every week I have the waiver wire article where I kind of rank priority for each player, and typically people want to know when they should use their number one waiver slot, because that's a coveted thing when you do have that number one waiver slot. And I always say it's a case by case basis, but I think when it comes to using that, you want to use it on, let's say, a running back, for example, that's going to provide you rest of season value as opposed to just a 2 to 3 week rental. So an example would be, Travis Etienne tweaks his ankle in week 1. Tank Bigsby, presuming he's available in most leagues, would be, the top ad for that week. However, he might only provide you 2 to 3 games of starter value. So I wouldn't necessarily use a number one waiver on him. If I have the number 5 waiver, I'd throw something out for him. But if Travis Etienne were to suffer a season-ending injury in week 1, you pretty much know that Tank Bigsby might offer you low-end running back 2 value the rest of the year. So I think in that scenario, I would consider a number one waiver wire or spending a lot more of my fab budget on getting a guy like Tank Bigsby. So it's a case-by-case basis. And a lot of the times, to be honest, a lot of these guys that people are gravitating towards or the top ad that week, they probably had their best game of the season, and people tend to overbid, overspend, blow their number one waiver on him. And, it's like a third string receiver, and we're just like, pump the brakes on it, relax. It's just one game. So I think a lot of the time I'm telling people to not spend too much, to not spend a top waiver slot. And I think that it's clear when you should is when they're going to be offering starting value, starting lineup value for your team for the rest of the season. And especially if you're hurting at that position, then you should, consider that over the others. But it's a case by case basis. And I base that decision based on how many games I think they're going to provide starting value on my team.
Chris, the do's and don'ts of the waiver wire and maybe how and when to trade.
Yeah. So, I mean, Sean really broke it down well. I would just add that, with the waiver wire, it depends where you are in the season. So if you're in week 9 and you need to win all of your remaining games to have a shot at the playoffs, then you might need to take a shot at a guy that gives you, 3 to 4 weeks or 2 to 3 weeks of value, because everything's a must win. And if you're weak at that position, and then there's the other end of the spectrum where you might have had a great season and you might have that, a top waiver priority all the way up into the playoffs, into championship week. If it's the last week of the season and you can use, even if it's not the number one, but you can use your waiver to like try to pick up somebody that your opponent might need. So let's say there's a streaming quarterback that has a projection or a ranking that's higher than the quarterback that your opponent has on its roster currently. You might want to pick that guy up just so that your opponent doesn't pick him up. If you have, that priority still. So there's things you could do like that. And then when it comes to trading, it's always about buying low and selling high. So studs will still have bad games sometimes. Sometimes they even have multiple bad games. Now, that could be a trend sometimes. If there's an older guy, we talked about busts, maybe it's a decline, but a lot of times it's just a couple bad matchups or, things that just don't work out. Football's there's a lot of randomness involved. So always want to buy low.
Coaching change.
Right.
Right?
Yep. And so you always want to buy low.
Or play calling change, not just necessarily head coach, but so-and-so's now, Joe Brady's going to call the plays now, not whoever the hell they fired in Buffalo last year.
Ken Dorsey. Yeah. So
Thank you.
you always want to kind of buy low on guys, especially guys that, were expected to play well or that are still getting the volume, but maybe the efficiency wasn't there. Touchdowns might not be there. Touchdowns are very hit or miss. And another thing, the key to trading, I would say, if people are going to take anything away, always try to trade multiple picks for a stud. Like, never try with trading. I'm almost never going for quantity. I'm always going for quality, because if I drafted quantity and I have a bunch of good players, that just means I had a good draft. So now I can use those guys to get like guys that locked in. I know I'm not going to have to bench, and especially that the need to do that as the season progresses gets even more important. So, if you're in week 10 and you're 8-2 or something like that, you can afford to trade maybe your number 2 and number 3 running back to get a second stud running back. And let's say you already have one, and there might be teams that are kind of on that playoff cusp that need that quantity. So always try to get studs on every position as you approach the playoffs. And just another little slick tip that I like, in season trading, you could trade away players who haven't had their bye yet, and trade 4 players who have already had their bye, and you're getting an extra week of production. So that's something that people might not think about when they're making these trades and valuing these players. It's like, oh, this guy already had his bye, so I'm gonna get him for the rest of the season, and he's not, if everything goes well, I'm gonna get him every single week. Whereas I might trade you a guy who has a bye 2 weeks later, so that's like minus 1 week of production that you're getting back. So that's another thing you can kind of do. But the big thing of trades is always try to acquire as many studs. So you like, the ideal is when you're hitting the playoffs to have studs at every single spot.
All right. Chris, Sean, this was great. Excellent stuff, guys. 6th annual Experts Guide to Fantasy Football. This was a lot of fun. I learned something. I'm excited now to go mock draft. I'm going to mock draft for days leading into my drafts. Any final thoughts before we get out of here? I think we covered it all.
Just sign up for our draft kit.
Yes, fantasylabs.com. We've been really consistent. We put a lot of work into our rankings. We have special rankings for best ball as well. So it's, we have our redraft rankings, and we have our best ball rankings where we're taking into account those ceilings and floors, and some of them are the same and some of them are different. But also just remember, you can't win your draft in the first few rounds, but you can lose it. Focus on those middle and those late round picks.
Yeah. I love how you said that, though, by the way, in that last bit about trading and waiver wire. Like, people do get obsessed if they had a great draft, but it doesn't really mean shit until you actually the games start happening. All right, Chris Raybon, Sean Kerner, 2 of Fantasy Pro's top 5 most accurate season-long rankers over the last couple of years. They were excellent providing their insights and analysis heading into your fantasy drafts. You can find both of them, of course, at the Action Network, actionnetwork.com. Sean, the Director of Predictive Analytics, Chris Raybon, NFL Analyst. My name is Brendan Glasheen. Thank you so much for tuning in. We hope you learned something or two. I think this is very productive. So with that, we say goodbye. Thanks for tuning in to the 6th Annual Experts Guide to Fantasy Football here on the Action Network podcast presented by BetMGM. Best of luck in your draft prep.